In the summer of 2008, Starbucks stock hit $14.69. A company that had been worth $29 billion just 2 years earlier was bleeding out in public. Analysts were not asking if Starbucks would collapse. They were asking when. 600 stores were closing, 1,000 employees were being let go, and for the first time in the company's history, same-store sales had gone negative. But here is what almost nobody talks about. The warning signs were there a full year before anyone panicked. One man saw all of it coming, wrote it down in a memo, and watched as the company ignored him anyway. This is the story of how Howard Schultz saved Starbucks from the greatest self-inflicted collapse in retail history. And what every brand in the world needs to understand about what actually happened. To understand how bad it got, you first have to understand how good it was. When Howard Schultz took over Starbucks in 1987, the company had fewer than 20 stores. By 2006, it had more than 12,400 locations in dozens of countries around the world. In some United States cities, there was a Starbucks on almost every block. In Seattle, the company's home, there was one store for every 14,000 people. At one intersection in the city, Starbucks occupied 3 of the 4 corners. The company was apparently considering opening a store on the 4th. Revenues were climbing at a compound annual growth rate of 36% since the initial public offering in 1992. Stock that was worth $1,000 at the initial public offering would have returned nearly $70,000 by June 2006. Wall Street loved it. Customers loved it. The press called it unstoppable. Then Howard Schultz started visiting his own stores. What he found disturbed him. Baristas no longer remembered customers' names. The large espresso machines blocked the line of sight between the customer and the drink being made. Schultz called that the theater of coffee. In some stores, the smell of burnt cheese from breakfast sandwiches was stronger than the smell of coffee. Stores were running out of ingredients. Some store managers seemed more interested in gross margins than in what was actually in the cup. Schultz had a word for what he was watching happen. He called it commoditization. Starbucks, the company he had spent 2 decades building into the world's most emotionally connected coffee brand, was starting to feel like any other chain. The financial metrics, still glowing green, were hiding every single one of these warning signs. On a gray morning in February 2007, Schultz sat alone at his kitchen table and wrote a memo to the senior leadership team. He called it the commoditization of the Starbucks experience. He started by acknowledging the decisions that got them there. The automatic espresso machines solved speed and efficiency problems but removed the romance of watching a barista craft a drink. The streamlined store design hit the right financial ratios but produced what some customers were now calling sterile, cookie-cutter spaces with no soul. The packaging changes delivered fresh coffee globally, but they stripped the stores of the one thing no amount of marketing can buy: the smell of freshly ground beans. He wrote that the company had made a series of decisions that, in retrospect, had led to the watering down of the Starbucks experience. He was careful not to blame any individual. Every decision, taken alone, probably made sense. But taken together, the sum was much more damaging than the individual pieces. He closed the memo with one line: "We desperately need to look into the mirror and realize it is time to get back to the core." On February 23, 2007, the memo leaked to the press. The Wall Street Journal ran it under the headline, "Starbucks Chairman Says Trouble May Be Brewing." The internet exploded. Analysts debated it. Bloggers tore it apart. Some said Schultz was sounding a genuine alarm. Others called it a publicity stunt. But inside the company, almost nothing changed. Schultz would later describe dropping into senior leadership meetings in mid-2007 and being struck by the lack of decisiveness and creativity around the table. Executives were obsessed with Wall Street's numbers. The urgency he was trying to create simply was not landing. He gave it 6 more months. Then he asked for a private meeting with the board. Quick pause. If you are into stories like this, brand collapses, comebacks, the decisions that made or broke billion-dollar companies, this channel is exactly that. New case study every week. Hit subscribe and you won't miss a single one. It takes 2 seconds. Now back to Starbucks. On January 6, 2008, Howard Schultz sat across from the man he had helped put in the chief executive chair just 2 years earlier, Jim Donald, and told him the board had decided it was time for Schultz to come back and take the wheel himself. The next morning, before the market opened and before anyone knew what was happening, Schultz let himself into the original Pike Place Market store in Seattle. The store was dark. He stood there alone and made 2 commitments to himself. First, he would not lean on the company's history and reputation to turn things around. Innovation and reinvention only. Second, he would never let blame slow them down. Given how fast the situation was deteriorating, there was simply no time to point fingers. That afternoon, he gathered his senior leadership team in the boardroom. "I'm going to ask more of you than has ever been asked before, Shindo-san," he told them. "And you must ask yourself whether you believe in Starbucks' mission, whether you believe we can do this." He invited anyone who wasn't sure to have a private conversation with him and leave the company with no hard feelings. Nobody took him up on it. But the numbers that were coming in told a different story than the optimism in that boardroom. Same-store sales, the most critical metric for any retailer, had gone into free fall. Not slowing, not declining, free fall. Daily comp store numbers were running negative in the double digits. Schultz later described checking the reports from his family vacation in Hawaii. He said he couldn't eat breakfast, couldn't enjoy his family. It was as if everything he feared was coming true. He called his friend Michael Dell, who was vacationing nearby and had recently returned as chief executive of his own company after a 2-year absence. Dell walked him through the challenges ahead, managing Wall Street while the business was lagging, rebuilding internal morale, navigating a collapsing economy. He also shared his company's transformation agenda, the structured plan that had guided Dell's own recovery. Schultz started building Starbucks' version of it immediately. Here is what the numbers looked like when Schultz officially returned as chief executive on January 7, 2008. The stock price was $23.39, a 40% decline from the year before. First quarter of 2008 revenues rose only 17.5%, the slowest growth in years. Same-store sales in the first quarter of 2008 rose just 1%. For context, the company had delivered 5% or better for 16 consecutive years. And then the economy collapsed. Lehman Brothers failed in September 2008. The insurance giant AIG required a federal bailout. The Dow Jones Industrial Average suffered its biggest single-day drop since September 11, 2001. Gas prices hit $4 a gallon. Milk, bread, and eggs all jumped in price. Consumer confidence cratered. Starbucks, which had built its entire brand on the idea that everyone deserved a small daily luxury, suddenly became a symbol of excess. McDonald's ran billboards that read, "$4 is dumb." The irony was brutal. A company that had spent 20 years positioning itself as the aspirational daily ritual of the middle class was now being used as a punchline for economic irresponsibility. Fourth quarter of 2008 profits fell 97%, from $158 million in the fourth quarter of 2007 to just $5.4 million. For the full year, net earnings were down 53%. Comparable store sales were negative 7%. And internally, the board asked Schultz's team to model what would happen if comps reached negative 14 or 15%. The answer was stark. Starbucks wasn't going to make it. The press had already written the company off. The debate wasn't whether Starbucks would collapse, it was when. What Schultz did next is the part that most case studies skip over, because the moves that actually saved Starbucks were not the dramatic ones. They were the disciplined ones. The first move was about the supply chain. Starbucks was coordinating 83,000 store deliveries a week worldwide. On any given day, stores had only a 35% chance of receiving all the supplies they needed. Expenses in the supply chain were growing by $100 million per year with no economies of scale. Schultz brought in Peter Gibbons to gut and rebuild the entire operation. Over 2 years, those changes delivered $400 million in savings. The second move was about the stores themselves. Schultz and his team identified the 600 worst-performing locations and closed them all at once, an action described internally as brutal. He did not want to go through that process twice. The announcement sent the stock to a 52-week low. but the bleeding had to stop before the healing could start. The third move was the most symbolic and the most expensive in the short term. On February 26, 2008, Starbucks closed every one of its 7,000 United States stores for one evening of espresso excellence training. 135,000 baristas were retrained in the art of making a proper shot of espresso. The door of every closed store had a sign that said, "We are taking time to perfect our espresso." Great espresso requires practice. That is why we are dedicating ourselves to honing our craft. It cost millions of dollars in lost revenue and partner wages. Wall Street did not love it, but it sent a message to employees, to customers, and to the market that Schultz was serious about going back to the core. Not just saying it, doing it. The fourth move was about connecting with the people inside the company. In October 2008, the same month Lehman Brothers collapsed and financial markets were in free fall, Schultz flew 10,000 store managers and partners to New Orleans, a $30 million conference. The board had pushed back hard. Schultz fought for it. Those 10,000 partners spent 4 days doing community service work in the neighborhoods still devastated by Hurricane Katrina. They built playgrounds, restored schools, painted murals. In total, they contributed over 54,000 hours of volunteer work and invested more than $1 million in neighborhood projects. When Schultz took the stage at the general session, he did not give a corporate presentation. He reminded 10,000 partners why they were there. He announced a partnership with Product Red to support AIDS relief in Africa. He brought Bono on stage, and what came back to him, in the faces of those managers and partners, was something the quarterly reports could not measure: belief, ownership, pride. One executive who was there described what Schultz built in New Orleans in one word: love. By the third quarter of 2009, the numbers started to move. Net earnings were up for the first time since late 2007. Operating income for the quarter hit $204 million, with an 8.5% margin compared to a loss in the same period the year before. The Starbucks VA Ready Brew instant coffee launched in September 2009 and hit $100 million in United States sales in its first 10 months. For reference, only 0.3% of product launches in any category ever reach $100 million in their first year. By the end of fiscal 2010, Starbucks reported record annual revenues of $10.7 billion. The stock closed the year at $25.94, up from under $15 at the depths of the crisis. By January 2014, when the Harvard Business School case study that forms the basis of this video was completed, Starbucks was reporting record quarterly revenues of $4.2 billion, earnings per share of 71 cents, and a share price of $78.57. Market capitalization was $59.4 billion, from near bankruptcy to the most financially successful period in the company's history in 6 years. So what actually happened here, and what should marketers understand about it? The easy answer is that Howard Schultz came back and saved the company. But that is not the real lesson. The real lesson is that Starbucks almost destroyed itself, not through bad decisions, but through the cumulative effect of individually reasonable decisions that no one was watching at the system level. Automatic espresso machines were reasonable, streamlined store design was reasonable, flavor-locked packaging was reasonable, rapid store expansion was reasonable. Each one on its own made sense. Together, they turned the world's most emotionally powerful coffee brand into a commodity. This is what Schultz called the sum being more damaging than the individual pieces. It is one of the most dangerous forces in brand management. Not a single catastrophic mistake you can point to and fix. A slow, invisible erosion of the thing that made you special. The second lesson is about what brand equity actually is. Starbucks did not sell coffee. It sold the romance of coffee, the theater of it, the smell of fresh grounds, the sight of a barista at work, the sound of your name being called, the warmth of a cup that felt like it was made specifically for you. The moment Starbucks started optimizing for efficiency over experience, it started selling a product that McDonald's could replicate for half the price. and the Consumer Reports taste test in 2007 that ranked McDonald's coffee above Starbucks? That was not a coffee failure. That was a marketing failure. When you strip out the experience, all you have left is the liquid in the cup. On that basis alone, Starbucks was losing. The third lesson is about the role of narrative in brand recovery. When Schultz closed those 7,000 stores for a single evening in February 2008, he did not save the company's finances that night. He saved the company's story. He told every customer, every barista, every investor, and every critic, we know what we are about, and we are willing to pay to get back there. That signal, expensive, disruptive, counterintuitive, is exactly what a brand in crisis needs. Not a press release, an act. Howard Schultz stood alone in a dark coffee store in Seattle in January 2008 and made two commitments to himself: innovate relentlessly and never waste time on blame. 6 years later, Starbucks was bigger, more profitable, and more culturally embedded than it had ever been in its history. But what I find most remarkable about this story is not the financial comeback. It is that the warning was there, in writing, in the memo, leaked and published and debated in the press, a full year before the crisis hit. And the company still waited until the stock was down 40%, until the comparable store sales were negative, until the press was calling for the chief executive's head, before it acted. That is not a Starbucks problem. That is a human problem. Organizations almost always know what is wrong before they do anything about it. The gap between knowing and acting is where brands go to die. Schultz did not save Starbucks because he had a plan nobody else could have built. He saved it because he was willing to act expensively, publicly, and without any guarantee that it would work. That willingness is the rarest thing in business. So here's the question I want you to sit with. What is your brand's equivalent of burnt cheese overpowering the smell of coffee? What small, reasonable decisions have been quietly eroding the thing that made you different? Because if you do not answer that question yourself, the market will answer it for you. If this video gave you a new way of thinking about brand erosion, drop a comment below. I would genuinely like to hear what it brought up for you. And if you want to see how a single 30-second ad destroyed 102 years of Jaguar's brand equity in a matter of months, that video is right here. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.